And by that I don't mean poverty, I don't mean an unpleasant life, I don't mean the inability to vote, the inability to access the courts, I don't mean being called a bad name, I don't mean living in poverty. That's not slavery. Those are bad things, but that's not slavery. What I'm talking about is the return of involuntary servitude, where in the rural South, in all of the places where there had been old-fashioned slavery before the Civil War on a significant scale, a new kind of involuntary servitude of African Americans returned with a force and vengeance which is difficult for us to comprehend today. And the way that that happened was that at the end of the Civil War, the white South simply could not resurrect its economy. The cotton economy of the South, on which the national economy was also extremely dependent, and so there was a complicity among white Americans all across the country. But the white South simply could not resurrect a cotton economy without access to these 4 million forced laborers who had been at their control until the end of slavery. And so there was a powerful economic motivation to return this huge population of people back into some sort of coerced labor, some sort of control of whites. And so for very economic reasons in the beginning, primarily economic reasons, whites began to look for opportunities and systems and mechanisms that could facilitate that. And at the same time, there was a recognition that doing so, that returning the emancipated slaves back into some sort of involuntary servitude also was a powerful weapon for forcing them out of the public life of our nation and out of citizenship and to begin to pull away from them these rights and to intimidate African Americans out of continuing to demand availability of the rights that they had been awarded at the end of the Civil War. Part of what was also happening then was that the South was also confused, the whole country was confused. White Americans everywhere were powerfully confused in the 1870s and 1880s about what to do with the freed slaves and their descendants. In every part of the country there was confusion about that. And in those few places in the North where there was a substantial black population, even though it still accounted for just a tiny fraction of the total African American population, but in places like New York City, which already had some substantial black population at the end of the war, there was tremendous violence and difficulty over how to reckon with the new position of the freed slaves. And so in the midst of all of that, in the white South, there also was this question of how do we control and manage these people who in the past lived under the purview of the slave master. And there was even a sort of theological and legal notions around that it was the slave master who had all authority. And so how to recreate that authority over African Americans without openly saying we're recreating slavery. And the obvious way to do that was through the judicial system. And so the South reconfigured its judicial system, and the laws of the South in the 1870s and the 1880s dramatically changed the way that the courts worked in the South in such a way that one of the primary purposes of the judicial system became to arrest as large a number of African Americans as possible and then compel them into labor as their punishment. And so the result of that was that all across the South, first, all across the South, every state legislature passed a grid of laws which effectively criminalized black life, which made it impossible for any African American man living in the rural South to live not in jeopardy of imminent arrest at all times. It was impossible, it became impossible for an African American man not to be in violation of some law in some way at almost any given time. It has parallels, though it's always dangerous to compare anything to anything related to the Holocaust, but it does have parallels to what happened to German Jewry in the early 1930s, when the first steps of the Nazi regime were to begin criminalizing aspects of common, typical Jewish life and begin to create this false basis for claiming that Jews were in fact criminals and arresting people. And then the first stages of that terrible process began with a reconfiguration of the law and the judicial processes. And a similar thing was happening in the South in a more chaotic, sloppier way, but a similar thing. And so it became the most basic thing. It became a fairly serious crime everywhere in the South not to be employed. This old notion of vagrancy as a legal concept was resurrected and redeployed and made more powerful in the southern states, and it became a crime for any man to be unable to prove at any given moment that he was employed. Well, of course, in 1900, 1901, a world in which there were no pay stubs. Hardly anyone in the South in an agricultural world even worked for hourly wage. You were paid by the day, or maybe you were paid at the end of a farming season if you were paid at all. Proving that you were employed was not a particularly easy thing to do. The only way to prove that you were employed was for there to be a landowner, almost certainly a white man, who would step forward and say, yes, he works for me, that's my Negro. If a black man did not have that protection of some white man who would do that for him for some reason, then he lived in this perpetual state of vulnerability, that he might be arrested simply for vagrancy. But it was also a crime, strange, odd things that are hard for us to understand now, but it was a crime for a farmer to sell the produce of his farm after dark. And the reason for that was to prevent a black man who was working on the land of a white man to be growing something on the side and then try to sell it to somebody other than the landowner. And so to stop someone from sneaking off in the night and trying to take their goods to a more open market, that became a crime. It was a crime to walk along a railroad anywhere in the South. Now, which happened to be in a period when the road systems of the South were absolutely derelict. There hardly was any kind of road infrastructure in the South. Walking along railroad lines or hopping into empty freight cars was an incredibly common form of transportation for all poor people. It became a crime. The first gun control laws were instituted in those days, specifically so that it became a crime. The intention was to make it impossible for a black man to be armed at any time. It's odd how the history of gun control and who's on what side of those issues has worked over the many decades. But the most, and of course, it was a crime, obviously, for there to be any kind of romantic or sexual relationship between a black man and a white woman. Not just a crime, but a violent affront against all of Southern sensibility, and to some degree Northern sensibilities even in those days. It was a crime to speak loudly in the company of a white woman. A black man could be arrested for that. But the most insidious thing was that it became a crime in every Southern state for any farm worker to seek employment from another landowner, a man who was working on the farm of one person, to seek employment from another landowner without written permission from the first man, from your current employer, was a crime. And there were thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of African-American men who were arrested over the decades simply for seeking employment from a different person than the one they worked for. So a black man who was working as a tenant or as a wage laborer or a sharecropper for a white man in South Georgia in 1905, who perhaps was being deprived of the proceeds of his work at the end of the season, was being cheated in the transaction about how to divide the crop, as was astonishingly common, who was being physically abused because of the whip and the lash were common elements of the Southern landscape deep into the 20th century, being physically brutalized, his family being brutalized in terrible ways. Any of those things might have been going on, but if he then sought employment without permission from another person, he was breaking the law. Now, none of those laws said this only applies to a black man, but overwhelmingly, in thousands and thousands and thousands of instances, it was only ever enforced against black people. And the intention was explicitly to criminalize black life, create this legal jeopardy that then began to hang over the head of every black man in the South and black woman, but though this was really primarily about black men, about suppressing black men. And so that grid of legality and deprivation of the rights of our society hung over the head of every African-American man, every African-American family, and so became a reason why even larger numbers of people went along with all of the other coercive practices and coercive aspects of Southern life. Why? It's part of the answer to the question that young people sometimes ask of, why did they put up with all of that? Why did my grandparents go along with that? How could they have allowed white people to not let them vote when there were more black people in the county than there were white? Why didn't the black people insist on their rights? And a part of that explanation through those long, dark years was because of this terrible legal jeopardy that was created. It also became part of the explanation for why America came to find it normal, not particularly extraordinary, for there to be this huge proportion of the black male population always under the control of the judicial system and the prison system, which is another issue that still intrudes so significantly into our present lives. So that's the story that Slavery by Another Name tells, how that happened, how those legal processes were set in place, the companies that benefited from them, from those processes, the commercial entities that were involved in it, some of which are still with us today. The single biggest user of this kind of forced labor in the early 20th century for a fairly long period of time was a subsidiary of U.S. Steel Corporation, so from right just down the road.